item, a brief presentation on a draft strategic plan for reforming the recreational black sea bass management. For that, Adam Nowalski, Board Vice Chair, has agreed to offer that presentation, and so I'll turn things over to Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now we can move from commercial summer flounder, where at least one state's unhappy, to wreckback sea bass, where we have at least 4 unhappy states. So thank you for the opportunity here. So the presentation we're going to go over details a document that can be found in the supplemental materials referred to as the Strategic Plan for Reforming Black Sea Bass Recreational Management. Our purpose here today is not to go ahead and have discussion in the document. The purpose here today is to go ahead and introduce the process of what leadership's been working towards to put these ideas out there for consumption and at least go ahead and get consent from these management bodies to continue to move forward with the process as we've outlined it. So the presentation we've put together will have a timeline of what reforming black sea bass recreational management might look like. We'll describe the major tracks that have been identified to date as areas that we think we can make strides in. We'll discuss next steps both here today and for the next couple of months, and just highlight what we're looking for some feedback for and those action items. So I think the first bullet point on this slide, recreational management is a work in progress, isn't any great surprise to anybody here in the room. I think it's been very clear in the last couple months that Addendum 30 didn't quite get us to where we hoped we would be with recreational black sea bass. It's been made very clear by board members. There have been a lot of ideas that have been discussed through a number of the working groups that have been formed to work on this issue, ideas from the public, ideas from other board and council members. So the purpose of this document was really to help synthesize all of the different ideas that we've heard about to date and try to put them in one place in an organized manner about how we might be able to use them, with the goal to improve the overall management program, principally by providing reasonable and equitable access to the resource, taking into account stock status and distribution, and bolstering accountability. So what this would highlight is a approach that would develop an interim program that would be in place for the next couple of years through 2020, and then paving the way for a fully amended program in 2021. So this next slide with the timeline here highlights the time frame that we'd be looking at to implement this. I don't think there's much surprise that we're going to be having ongoing discussions. Addendum 30 is not likely to be our venue for black sea bass management in 2019. So it would be the goal to develop for 2019 and 20 another management document. And in that same time frame, we'd have a parallel program in place that would look at a full program for fully modifying what we need to change in recreational black sea bass management, with that implementation going into place in 2021. As we go on to the next slide, which highlight the 4 tracks for this parallel implementation, kind of goes ahead and highlights what things are going to be dovetailing together. Our first area is with regards to stock status. We know that the SSB is well above the target, high biomass despite ACL, RHL overages that have occurred in rec management, and we have, as a result of the last stock assessment, subspatial units that have allowed for how we change management. Catch and effort data, we've spoken ad nauseum about concerns about both the MRIP data as well as discards would have been largely driven by management decisions. We also think there's opportunities to better involve the public here with regards to self-reported data to go ahead and help either strengthen what we know about MRIP for the better or for the worse in order to get better data. From a management perspective, again, we've had a lot of these different ideas approached. in an effort to change how we manage black sea bass. Catch versus harvest, F-based approaches, multi-year specifications and evaluations, and again, the goal being to achieve that equity and access that anglers have really talked about. And then the fourth track that we've talked about is stakeholder engagement, getting the public here involved in the process, reporting, best handling techniques, venting fish in deeper water with some of the studies that we've had recently. So we've got a number of those different ideas here. I'm not going to get into a great amount of detail with each of the individual tracks that are here. Again, our goal isn't today to go ahead and speak about the pros and the cons of them, but what is important is that we do need all board and council members to go back, look through the document, and get back to us, board leadership, council and board staff, with regards to have we encompassed in this document the ideas that you all envision for how we can improve our recreational management. Again, we tried to capture the ideas we had heard over the years, but if there's some new ideas or some things you don't feel that have been captured, we need to go ahead and get them captured. So how are we going to go ahead and move forward with this information, and what's going to be the use of the document? So today, we're presenting this document so it's fully transparent and that it becomes a board-owned document. Bob wants to call it my document. I want to call it his document. We gave it to Caitlin. Right now it's Caitlin's document. I don't think she wants it long term. So hopefully we can leave here today and this can be a board and council document moving forward. So what we'd be looking for is just consent here today for leadership to continue working forward with staff on development. Now, what's that going to look like? Over the course of the next month, again, what we need to do is we need to solicit further input from yourselves, as well as in working with individual state fishery councils, stakeholders. Are there ideas that we don't see in this document right now that you think we need to be looking at? Is there anything in the document right now that is just completely egregious and there should be no further consideration of? If that's the case, then we need to hear about that as well. Once we go ahead and get that input, it would be the intention of board and council leadership to work with staff and GARFO to identify and clarify the tasks, actions, and timeframes needed to achieve those key elements and strategies that we've identified in the document. Once we've gone ahead and identified how we can accomplish a number of those things within the timelines we've set forth, we would then want to see a joint working group, and we've heard from both board and council leadership. Chris Moore's been involved in those discussions as well, who's not here today, that we would convene a joint working group between the board and the council. We've frequently heard the board say, well, we don't have as much say in the quotas as we'd like. We've heard the council say we don't have as much say in the setting of measures as we'd like. So this would be an opportunity for those two groups to continue to work together, primarily with an initial goal of what's that 2019 and 2020 management program going to look like. In parallel to that, there will be the larger long-term tasks to look at implementing 3 years down the road. Why are we focusing on that 3-year time frame? The primary reason for that is because we expect another benchmark stock assessment to occur in 2020 to inform 2021 management. So that's our reason for looking at that 3-year time frame to implement something more substantial. In terms of moving forward with 2019-2020 management, in August we'll again be convened jointly where we'll discuss a 2019 ABC. It is currently our hope and our expectation that the number that we come up with for the ABC in 2019 may wind up changing. Now, we just went through this process last year where we decided on an ABC. We then got an updated stock assessment, a new stock assessment, and we had to go through a process of revising it. We expect something similar is going to happen this year. We'll get a data update from the Science Center as well as the revised MRIP numbers. So we expect what we'll do this summer is just going to be an interim placeholder number. We expect to be able to bring back to the board an additional synthesis of the ideas that you've had in consideration of additions or removals from the document, and we can then begin crafting an addendum, whatever management document we need to address 2019 and 2020 management, which is hopefully a big step forward instead of initiating that process in October. In October, we then have that draft addendum, again with the idea that it's been a work in place, not just being initiated out of the blue at that point, but a work in place for 4 to 6 months at that time. And then ultimately December would approve that addendum for 2019 management. So I'm sure there's lots of questions about what specifically is in the document, but again, our goal here today is not to debate those items, but again, what we're looking for is, does the idea of having a strategy document serve as a useful and appropriate platform for guiding reform moving forward? And then the question we need answered from you in the next month is, does it capture the most important elements? Any key issues to be added, removed, or modified? So our action items, I mentioned the data update. The council has previously discussed stressing to the NRCC the need to get an operational update for black sea bass as soon as possible. Prior to that benchmark occurring, we've had some discussion about that here at the Commission as well, and I'll turn back to the board chair for further discussion about what other actions he might request here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate that presentation. And just to reiterate, this is really intended to be the initiation of a brainstorming exercise, and we recognize that that will take some time. This is a document that we wanted to introduce today and briefly present, as Adam has just done, but then basically park it and let it develop, if you will, over the course of the next several months via your input. I mean, the most phenomenal outcome from my standpoint would be to hear from each and every member of the board and commission, having reviewed this document over the next month or so, to see, does it address the key issues that you think need to be address in order to move forward with regard to this managing this fishery, and then start to maybe hone in on some priorities, and by the time we hit our joint meeting in August, maybe have something that's a little bit more fully developed, hopefully fully supported, and it may well serve as a guidepost for our efforts over the next 2 to 3 years. And frankly, I think we really do need something like that to guide our efforts over the next 2 to 3 years. So that was the intent. We purposely wanted to provide it today, but not engage in any substantive discussion today. It's too early for that. We just simply wanted to tee it up, let you know where it came from, what it's about. It is rather ambitious. It is comprehensive. It speaks both to short-term and long-term issues. It speaks to science and management and stakeholder engagement. It's really intended to be the full enchilada to hopefully get us over the end line with regard to the challenges we've been facing managing this fishery. So with that, and again, the only real action item, if you want to call it that, would be to just reiterate something that this board and council have already expressed, and that is the importance of conveying to our leadership on the NRCC, which I understand will be meeting in just a few weeks, the importance of prioritizing that operational update for late 2018, early 2019, so that it can be used for management purposes in 2019. It seems absolutely essential that we have updated stock assessment information in order to move forward over the next couple of years, and that does seem to be the most important short-term issue that's in this document. Other than that, and maybe Caitlin, if you could just switch back to the prior slide, again, only looking today for a high-level discussion. Maybe there's no need for any discussion, maybe just a comment or two if one exists. We don't plan to spend more than another 5 or 10 minutes on this agenda item unless there's a strong interest in doing more, but that we're really going to try to hold this to just 5 or 10 minutes at the most. But again, these are the issues that we just simply wanted to tee up today, and with that I'll look to any member of the board or council who'd like to comment. Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great plan. Fully support it. Move ahead. Thank you.
With that, we'll move on to the next item. Seriously, thank you, Jim. And we are really indeed looking for that kind of indication of support, if it exists. And again, deeply appreciated. I see Dr. Hare's hand up in the back. I also saw Tony DeLernia's hand up. So let me first, John, if it's okay, let me just go quickly to some of the council members and board members who wish to speak, and then I will absolutely get to you. Tony DeLernia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question is for the chairman of the council, to Mr. Luisi. Where does the development of the letter of authorization proposal stand in this process?
I'll answer if I can, and then let Mike jump in. There is I don't know exactly where it is. I'd have to pull out the document, but there's a line in there that addresses the Wave 1 fishery issue. That, when I say addresses it, that tees up the Wave 1 fishery issue to be further addressed. Granted, Tony, it doesn't get into the kind of detail, letter of authorization approach. To be honest with you, that's exactly the kind of input we're looking for. I think hopefully what you and other members of the board and council can do is find the issues in this document that you deem most important, and then help us flesh them out. Give us what we need as leadership to say, here it is, and now I want to add some flesh to those bones. I want to make sure that this document reflects the plan that you want to pursue as a member of the council, in this case, to pursue that LOA program. Go ahead.
Thank you. To that point, my primary goal would be to reopen the Wave 1 fishery. But secondary goal is the aspects that are contained in the letter of authorization, I believe, help us move towards better managing recreational fishermen and have recreational fishermen take more responsibility for their fishery, for the management of their fishery. And so while if folks say, well, we'll just reopen it to a Wave 1 fishery with a quota and let it go at that, I don't think that's the type of progress that we should be making. Yes, I would like to see it opened, but I think there are elements to my letter of authorization proposal that also must be considered as a small step towards recreational fishermen taking more responsibility for their fishery, and towards us experimenting with the evolution of the management of recreational fisheries. And so that's why I believe the LOA program is very important, and I would not like to see that suffer as a result of just having a Wave 1 fishery open without any additional restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you. David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. You had an action item up there relative to the operational assessment. Do you want a motion?
Let's hear from Dr. Hare first. I have a feeling he may be able to speak to that issue. I'm not sure if that's why his hand was up. But John, why don't you come up to and offer your thoughts, whatever they may be, whether they're in response to David Borden's question just now or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to comment on the stock assessment schedule that the NRCC has approved. The NRCC has prioritized benchmark assessments for summer flounder and striped bass for the fall of 2018. So that fall of 2018 calendar is full, unless the NRCC wants to change its decision in our upcoming May meeting. Those benchmark assessments will include the new MREP data. So those are being treated as benchmarks to evaluate a variety of different methods for including those data. And the NRCC, is currently on schedule, planned the schedule for operational assessments in the first half of 2019. And those operational assessments would include, presumably, a black sea bass operational assessment.
Thank you for that. So I really think, David, we don't need a motion so much as we just need to know whether there's any objection on the part of members of the council or board to ask our leadership and those participating in the NRCC meeting in a couple weeks to ensure that this is a item that's prioritized. David?
Yeah, so, I mean, the follow-up question then is, will the operational assessment in the fall of spring of 2019 be available at the point that we set the specifications for the year?
That is let's put it this way. We've been discussing this issue, and my understanding is that it's our intent to it's our intent to advise NRCC, our representatives on the NRCC, that it is our hope and our expectation to see if it's possible to get the operational assessment done in time for use for 2019.
And I totally support that intent, but I just point out to everybody, and I'm not telling the members of Mid-Atlantic Council anything, the reason we're in this bind is because when the SSC at the mid did the stock assessment, the status of the 2015 year class was somewhat uncertain, and therefore they couldn't characterize it properly, and they had to assume that the 2011 year class was going to decline because it's kind of exiting the fishery. And that's one of the reasons we face this cut this year and have gone through all the pain this year. So unless we expedite this and get this done between now and the time we do the specifications, we're going to have a repeat of this year, and we don't want to go there.
Mike Louisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to the point, we're going to need to do specs in August. We won't have the new information from the operational assessment available in August, obviously. However, we've done it before where once the specs are set for 2019, we could make a modification to those specifications after the turn of that operational assessment update. If it informs us to the point where we can modify that quota, it's certainly the council's intent to work with staff to get that done. But it's important that it happen as early in the year as possible after the other benchmarks are finished. If we wait too long, the process in and of itself it wouldn't be until the end of next year before we could modify that quota. So that's kind of what we're looking at this point. Thank you.
Adam Nowalski?
The interim program that we're looking to develop is not going to be solely dependent on getting a revised ABC or new information. That was one of the points of having 4 different tracks: science, management, stakeholder input, etc., so that we could go ahead and work in areas where we do get improved information, improved ways of doing things. We can leverage those and go ahead and work with. Our goal would be to get this new information, but again, if we don't, that doesn't mean this whole interim program we're proposing to develop comes to a halt.
Thank you. Any further? Yes, Dr. Hare.
Yeah, just to remind the council and the commission, the center will be providing a data update in June, and presumably that information would be available for setting specs in August.
Thank you for that. Any additional comments, questions? If not, again, we just want to leave you with those 2 discussion and guidance prompts, if you will. So please take those to heart over the next few weeks as you return home, read through this document, and mark it up, and literally mark it up and send it back into, I think Caitlin Starks will serve as our point person on staff for this as well. I'm sure the MID might be able to partner with her on this. Let's say Brandon Muffley as well. So Brandon and Caitlin would be your 2 points of contact on staff for submitting any comments you might have. And again, we urge you to offer your thoughts and comments on this document. We will then do our best to try to put it through the viability threshold test in terms of what's actually doable, meeting with staff, with the Science Center, with Garfo, and then work with a working group, then bring it to a working group process, and do that in, say, July. I realize this is rather ambitious, but we do want to move forward with this in an expeditious way. And so the last thing I would say is that if you are interested in participating in that rec working group process, it's definitely intended to be joint council and board. Please let us know, and again, probably let staff know. That would be the best way to respond. Not looking for a show of hands right now, but to the extent that you're interested in working with us to kind of further develop this document for a more thorough vetting at our August meeting, please do so. We'd welcome your participation, and we, again, hope that this is something that can really help to guide us forward in the years to come. If there's nothing else, I'm happy to put an end to this discussion and move on to our next agenda item. Thank you, Adam, for your presentation and your support on this, and thank you all for your, let me just say for the record, is there any objection to moving forward in the short term as proposed? Seeing no objection, we appreciate your support, and we will move forward with this initiative, and there'll be a lot more to come in the weeks, months ahead. So with that, we will move on to our next item. Thank you very much. Our next item is to review alternatives for a recreational framework and addendum, or a framework and addendum on recreational issues. We're actually talking during lunch as to what to actually call this. So let's call it a framework and addendum on recreational issues pertaining to summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. This is a joint action item. It involves the review of draft alternatives that would address 3 issues: conservation equivalency in the recreational black sea bass management program, transiting in Block Island Sound for all 3 species, and slot limits for all 3 species. The goal today is to seek consensus on a range of alternatives for further development by staff. So we're not approving a document per se today. We're really looking to just get consensus on a range of alternatives for further development. And then the plan would be to have those ready for final consideration as drafts for public comment by our August joint meeting. Again, I'm sure Julia will be speaking more specifically to that time frame. So I'll stop talking and move the mic over to Julia Beatty from the Fishery Management Specialist with the Council, who with Caitlin Sparks, the Fishery Management Plan Coordinator with the Commission, will offer a presentation on these issues. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So Caitlin and I are going to tag team on this presentation. I'm going to start out. Bob already covered some of the things that I was going to say. So just to reiterate that the goal today is to decide what alternatives will be included in this framework and addendum, so that between now and the joint August meeting we can develop a draft public hearing document. So now is the time to make any substantial changes. If we do that now, we have time to address that and still meet our goal for when we take final action. If any substantial changes are made further down the road, that will delay things. But again, now is the time that if you want any changes, hopefully let us know today. So again, the framework and addendum covers these 3 topics: conservation equivalency for black sea bass, transit provisions for Block Island Sound, and slot limits. I'm going to present on this part of it. And then there's another issue that's been discussed by both the board and the council, which is the idea of evaluating and modifying recreational management measures based on the ACL rather than the RHL. This was something that was part of Addendum 30. And this is technically not part of the framework and addendum, but it's kind of been discussed along the same lines, and it could have some implications for at least the black sea bass conservation equivalency alternatives. So Caitlin's going to talk more about this particular aspect, but again, this is technically not part of the framework and addendum at this time. So we formed an FMAT for this framework and addendum. So an FMAT is a fishery management action team. They're groups that the council forms for amendments typically. We don't typically form them for frameworks, but we decided to do that for this one because it's some of the analysis might be a little bit more involved than the typical framework. So the FMAT is a technical team that assists with developing and analyzing alternatives. They've discussed this action, and then we also had a meeting of the demersal committee and a subset of the board. So for each of these topics, we'll summarize recommendations from both the FMET and the committee and board subset. It just says committee, but it should also say and board subset. Sorry about that. So jumping right into the framework and addendum alternatives, the first set of alternatives is for conservation equivalency. So for every time we consider an action, we always consider the no action alternative. So that would be, what would happen if we didn't do anything? And that's alternative 1.A, draft alternative. And so under the no action alternative, we can't use conservation equivalency for black sea bass, which means that the federal waters measures and the recreational fishery can't be waived in favor of the state waters measures like is done for summer flounder. So alternative 1.B would be to update both the council and the commission's FMPs to allow conservation equivalency to be used for black sea bass in the future. And then there's 2 different ways of doing that, 2 sub-alternatives. The first one is we could use exactly the same process as the summer flounder conservation equivalency. And then the second option is use the summer flounder process, but with 1 or more specific modifications. And we want to be able to call out any specific modifications that we're considering, call them out as sub-alternatives so it can be clear, like this is specifically what is going to be considered in terms of changes. So there are 3 specific changes that were brought forward by considered by the FMET and the committee and the board subgroup. So if you have any additional modifications that you want to consider, let us know today. So the first modification to the summer flounder process is to allow conservation equivalency to roll over from year to year when appropriate. And what that means is that the federal waters measures would continue to be waived from one year to the next. So under the summer flounder process, conservation equivalency expires at the end of the year, and then it's not implemented again for the next year until usually the spring of the next year. So there's a gap in the beginning of the year when technically the federal waters measures are in place until conservation equivalency is implemented again and those measures are waived. And this can be confusing. So the idea is that if conservation equivalency could roll over from one year to the next, then the measures could stay, the federal waters measures could stay waived. And it just might add a little bit more efficiency to the process, but we would still have to ensure that the precautionary default and the non-preferred coastwide measures would still need to be appropriate for the next year. So the council and board would still need to review the use of conservation equivalency each year. It's just there might be some savings in terms of the rulemaking process that is needed to be done. So that's one specific change that could be considered from how we do things for summer flounder. Another specific change that has come up as an idea is having the council and board decide together what the state and regional allocations of the RHL would be. So those allocations are, very important when they're like the basis for how the states and regions come up with their measures under conservation equivalency. And currently, the council doesn't have a role in those allocation decisions. It's just decided by the board. So one option would be to have it be a joint decision. And then the last specific modification is to have the option to manage to the ACL rather than the RHL. The summer flounder conservation equivalency regulations say that harvest must be constrained to the RHL in a given year. And that's the only place in the regs for all 3 species that it says that harvest has to be constrained to the RHL. So the black sea bass conservation equivalency regulations could be written to have a little bit more flexibility. We could just not specify that it has to be the RHL, so you could have the option of doing one or the other, or it could specify ACL. And that's something that if you read that strategic plan document that it's in, this ACL issue is something that has come up and something that we've been asked to consider. So a little bit more background on all of those alternatives, just to remind you how the summer flounder process works in terms of how it could be done for black sea bass and how it could be done differently. Every year in December, the council and board decide together whether to use coastwide measures or conservation equivalency. And if they agree to conservation equivalency, then they need to also agree to a set of non-preferred coastwide measures. And a set of precautionary default measures. So the non-preferred coastwide measures are supposed to be, what collectively the state and regional measures are supposed to be aiming to be equivalent to that. And then, so After that decision is made in December, then the states and regions work on their proposals, the TC reviews them, and then the board considers them for approval. If a proposal is not considered, a state or region can typically resubmit, and if they don't get to a place where they have a approved proposal, then they're supposed to implement the precautionary default measures. And then after the proposals are all approved or it's decided that the precautionary default needs to be used, then the commission sends a letter to NIMS certifying that the combination of all those proposals will collectively constrain harvest to the RHL, and then if NIMS agrees, then they waive the federal waters measures. So that can kind of give you an idea of why it takes until the spring of the next year to implement conservation equivalency, because there's a lot of steps that need to happen. So some FMAT recommendations related to this is that the FMAT recommended that this action focus on simply updating the FMPs to allow conservation equivalency to be used in a future year, instead of coming up with a plan for how to use it in 2019. That's partly because of the timeline that we have planned for this action. We're hoping to take final action in December, which that alone might be kind of ambitious, but then we have all these other actions happening. We have the new MREP numbers coming soon. And then also, you know, if we were to come up with options for use in 2019, we might have it might be worth coming up with a set of backup measures in case this framework and addendum isn't actually approved in time to be used in time of the start of the 2019 fishing year. So basically, there's a lot of decisions that need to be made. Again, allocations are an important part of conservation equivalency, and we don't have an acceptable allocation scheme at the moment that could be incorporated into this. So there's a lot that goes into this, and it would be pretty challenging to actually use conservation equivalency for black sea bass in 2019. So the FMAT is recommending just using this action to update the FMP to say that it could be used in a future year, and then in a future action use it for a particular year. So the committee and board talked about this, and there was agreement that the conservation equivalency process is already fairly drawn out, and anything that can be done to streamline that process would be beneficial. So conservation equivalency rollover was a specific example of something that could help streamline the process and make it more efficient, so there was support for that. In terms of having the council and board jointly decide on RHL allocations, some concerns were raised about that. There was concern that it would make the whole process a little bit less efficient, because with the council's requirements for analysis and the documents that we need to do, it could drag the process out a little bit. And then also there was concern about the balance of representation among the states if the council and board were to vote together, because the states are evenly represented on the board, but Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are not on the council. So if the council were added into the voting mix, that would, change the balance of representation among the states. And then in terms of the FMAT's recommendation to not develop alternatives for 2019, the committee and the board said they wanted to keep that option on the table. At least at the time of that meeting. They did talk about the concerns about the feasibility of that, but they weren't willing to take that off the table at that point in time. Also, something that I didn't include a bullet on, but there was some discussion of the conservation equivalency rollover. There was discussion about needing to make sure that the measures are appropriate to roll over from one year to the next. So at the committee and board subgroup meeting, there was discussion of maybe in the future crafting the precautionary default and non-preferred coast-wide measures with that flexibility in mind to hopefully allow rollover to happen. So that's all I had for that set of alternatives. And again, my plan is to run through all the alternatives in the framework and addendum and then have discussion at the end. So the next set of alternatives is Block Island Sound transit provisions. This has been an issue for the black sea bass recreational fishery in recent years. Because the federal waters in recent years were closed from September 22nd through October 21st. And some of the states around Block Island were open during that time of year, not in every year, but in some years there were situations where federal waters were closed and state waters were open. So in those cases, if you were fishing for black sea bass recreationally off of Block Island in state waters and you wanted to travel back to the mainland, you have to travel through federal waters to get there. And so technically, if you kept any black sea bass while you were going through federal waters, then you were in violation, even if you caught those black sea bass in state waters. So this is considering adding transiting provisions similar to what exists for striped bass, so that vessels could catch black sea bass in state waters off Block Island and then transit back to the mainland. So this is something that would require a change to the federal regulations. So it could just be something that's done through the council's FMP, but we're proposing including it in both the council and the commission's documents, even if it doesn't necessarily need a change to the commission's FMP, but just to make it, clear that we're considering this and that it's something that can be decided on together, and to help get more public input, just to include it in both documents, even though it doesn't necessarily need a change to the commission's FMP. So the alternatives here are, again, no action, and then 2.B is to have these transit provisions for Block Island Sound. And when this was initially discussed, it was discussed as it should only be a recreational issue and only situations where state waters are open and federal waters are closed. But when the committee and board subgroup talked about this, they wanted to add in consideration of commercial vessels as well, and also situations where the bag limit or the minimum fish size is more restrictive in state waters than in federal waters. So that's how we laid out the alternatives here, is that there could be sub-alternatives where you would decide if it's for recreational only or for commercial and recreational, and which measures it applies to. And again, it's been discussed as if the striped bass regulations could be an example. We could use the same area, the same definition of the area, because that would simplify things for enforcement. So the FMAT recommended that this apply to summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. It hasn't been an issue for summer flounder in recent years because of conservation equivalency. The federal waters measures are waived, and it hasn't been an issue for scup because the federal waters season has been open year-round for several years, but the FMAT recommended just making these transiting provisions apply to all three species. And the FMAT recommended that it only apply to recreational fisheries in only situations where federal waters are closed and state waters are open, because that would be much more simple to enforce than if bag limits and minimum fish sizes were also considered. And back at the December joint meeting, there was some discussion of should this apply to other species besides summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. And the FMAT said, no, keep it to those species for now, because if doing it for other species would require changes to other FMPs, and that's outside the scope of this action. But it's not that complicated of a change, so as new actions come up for other species, it could be added on to those. So I already said this, the committee and the board recommended adding in consideration of commercial fisheries and situations where the minimum fish size and possession limits are different in state and federal waters. And the commercial fisheries issue, my understanding is that it's an issue for state-only permitted vessels in Rhode Island. And the FMAT didn't really discuss that in detail because it's something that came up at the committee and board subgroup meeting, which was after the FMAT meeting. So the last set of alternatives for the framework and addendum is slot limits. And again, this is something that only the council needs to take action on, because the council's FMP does not allow specification of a maximum size limit. And so we need to do a framework to add that in there. But an FMP change is not needed on the commission side. So again, although this is something that is council only, we're recommending, keeping it in the documents for both council and commission, but making it clear that the commission's FMP doesn't need to change to do this. So this is really simple. You either take no action or you update the FMP to allow specification of a maximum size. And if we could use the maximum size, then that allows for use of regular slot limits, split slot limits, and trophy fish. So it's just a simple change that's needed to do all those different things. So again, the FMAT recommended that this change to the FMP be made for all three species, just so it can be an option that could be used in the future. It could be a tool in the toolbox, even if it might not ever be used for scup, for example, because scup aren't really that big, so we might not ever really want to use a maximum size. And again, like conservation equivalency, if this were to be used in 2019, that could be a little bit logistically challenging, given the proposed timeline and the analysis that would be needed to analyze specific slot limits. But if the council and board wanted to go that way, it might be helpful to also consider a backup set of measures without slot limits, just in case slot limits can't be approved in time to use at the start of the 2019 fishing season. And then the FMAT also wanted to remind everyone that the monitoring committee has analyzed slot limits for summer flounder in the past, and that they should have a chance to revisit and weigh in on any specific slot limit alternatives that are considered in the future. Committee and board subgroup recommendations on this. So again, the FMAT said that this should be a tool in the toolbox for all 3 species, but some committee and board members had concerns about using it for black sea bass because a slot limit could increase discarding of larger fish, and there was concern that larger black sea bass have a higher mortality from barotrauma than smaller black sea bass. So there was concerns that that could be problematic with slot limits. And then there was some discussion of previous monitoring committee analysis of summer flounder slot limits that said that in order to be effective and to constrain harvest to the RHL, a slot limit would need to be very narrow for summer flounder. And given the stock status of summer flounder at the moment, it might not be worth considering a slot limit at this point in time, because a narrow slot limit probably wouldn't really be all that palatable to anglers. And again, there was some discussion about using it in 2019, concerns about timing, but the committee and board didn't want to take that option off the table at this point in time. So the discussion points for the framework and addendum is these alternatives that I've laid out, are these acceptable? Are there any changes needed? And if so, what are the specific changes so that we can take those recommendations and work them into a draft public hearing document. So just to remind you what the alternatives are, these are the conservation equivalency alternatives for black sea bass, and then these are the Block Island Sound transit provisions and slot limit alternatives. So we can flip back to these when we get to the discussion points. So that's all I had for the things that are included in the framework and addendum right now, and then Caitlin has a few slides about this ACL issue.
Thanks, Julia. So as she mentioned, the last issue we have to discuss on this is whether to include options for specification and evaluation of measures using the ACL instead of the RHL, and whether to include those specifically in this framework addendum. So as we currently do it, management of black sea bass uses the RHL to specify and evaluate measures, and as she explained a little bit earlier, Addendum 30 provided an option to use the ACL instead of the RHL. So when the board approved Addendum 30 in February 2018, they approved this option in concept with delayed implementation pending further refinement by the board and council. So that's why we've been discussing it as the FMAT and with the demersal committee and subset of the board as a possible item to include here in this framework addendum. And the provision as written in Addendum 30 allows measures to be specified based on the previous year's projected catch, so including harvest and discards, and then allows fishery performance to be evaluated by comparing a single year's catch to that year's ACL. So if the ACL is exceeded, then the catch would be compared to a 3-year moving average of the ACL. And to give a picture of what this looks like, the figure up here shows the catch ACL and the 3-year average of the ACL for 2018 going back to 2012. And you can see that in addition to harvest exceeding the RHL for the past several years, as we know it has, catch has also exceeded the ACL in all of these years, and it's also exceeded the 3-year moving average of the ACL in all of these years. So also to note, in all of these cases, the 3-year average ACL is either the same or lower than the single-year ACL. So if the intent of this approach is to provide some more stability from year to year and reduce the need to annually adjust measures based on comparing harvest to the RHL, based on the data in this figure, we can see that comparing catch to the ACL wouldn't necessarily get us to that desired outcome. And in Addendum 30, The ACL provision also specifies that the states would be required to make improvements in data collection and compliance in 5 different areas, which are biological sampling, reduction in refusal rates of MRIP intercept surveys, discard composition information, reduction in discarding, and improved angler compliance. So as Julia said, as of now, the council and board have not approved this issue for inclusion in the Recreational Management Framework Addendum. However, as she mentioned, it could have implications for black sea bass conservation equivalency. So we're asking the board and council to choose whether or not to include this issue in the framework addendum. Alternatively, it could be addressed through a different process, such as the strategic planning that we talked about a little bit earlier today. So when the FMAT discussed this issue, they noted that the FMP and regulation changes may not be needed to implement this approach because for black sea bass and scup, the FMP requires constraining catch to a single year ACL, although currently the RHL is used as the annual management target. However, for summer flounder conservation equivalency, it does require constraining harvest to the RHL. Another issue that the FMAT discussed is that this approach it proposes comparing 1 year of catch to a 3-year average of the ACL, which is inconsistent with the way that ACL evaluation is used for the council's accountability measures. So it might be worth considering using instead a comparison of 3 years of catch to 3-year average of the ACL. In years of increasing ACLs, comparing 1 year of catch against 3 years of the ACL could result in a need for more reductions than if catch is compared to a single year of the ACL. So again, comparing 3 years of both would not result in that issue. A third point that the FMAT brought up is the concern with the timing of data availability. So as we know, discard estimates for 1 year are not available until midway through the following year, which would make it really difficult to evaluate fishery performance and craft measures on the same timeline that we currently follow for black sea bass. So we wouldn't be able to implement changes based on year 1 discard overages or underages until late in year 2 at the absolute earliest. And overall, the FMAT just noted that the ACL topic warrants further development by the TC and MC, and some further clarification is needed on the intent of this approach. And in March, when the demersal committee and subset of the board discussed this topic, some committee and board members were concerned that managing to the ACL would disadvantage the northern states given the regional differences in availability and size distribution of black sea bass. And in addition, the group noted that concerns regarding the accuracy and precision of the data that we use in our current process, as well as the challenges with the timing of our current process, would be exacerbated if measures were evaluated against the ACL, because then we would have to be incorporating discard information from MRIP. And the group lastly discussed the potential for evaluating recreational fisheries on multiple years of performance and multiple years of RHLs and or ACLs, and that this could improve the efficiency of the process and result in less frequent modifications of our recreational management measures. So that might be worth considering alongside this ACL issue. So today what we're looking for is for the board and council to consider whether or not to include these alternatives for evaluating the fishery against the ACL in this framework addendum. And if this is something the board and council do choose to include in the document, then we have several items that need some clarification. So first, is the intent of this to set measures to achieve the RHL and then evaluate against the ACL, or is it to use the ACL for both setting specifications and for fishery evaluation? And it's worth keeping in mind with that question that discards are much more difficult than landings to control, estimate, and project, and that the new MRIP information will likely have implications for this. Second, the board and council should specify which years would be included in a 3-year moving average of the ACL, and then lastly, clarify whether this process is meant to be applied just to black sea bass or also to scup and fluke. And with that, I'll pass it back to Julia.
Thanks. I just wanted to go over the timeline to, help everybody think about what we're trying to do and the amount of time that we have to do it in when you're thinking about what to add on to this action. So again, the goal today is to approve a set of draft alternatives so that between now and the August joint meeting, staff and the FMAT and maybe even the monitoring and technical committee can develop those alternatives and do some preliminary analysis of them. We also have the AP and Monitoring Committee are already planning to meet in June and July to talk about specifications like they do every year. So we might have them weigh in on this action at that point too, since they'll be meeting anyway. And then, so after a public hearing document is approved at the August joint meeting, then the Commission can go out and do public hearings in the fall. The Council doesn't need to do public hearings for frameworks, so we're planning for that just to be a Commission thing. And then in the fall, again, the AP and Monitoring Committee, they're going to meet anyway to talk about recreational specifications. So if we want them to weigh in on this again, we could do it then. And then, again, the goal is to take final action in December. So this is a framework for the Council. We need to have at least 2 framework meetings, and so we're going to call the August meeting our Framework 1, like the official Framework 1 meeting, and the December meeting the Framework 2 meeting. And so I think that's all we had. And again, the decision points and discussion for today is, do you have any suggested changes to the alternatives that we laid out? Do you want to add anything? And then again, this ACL issue, is that something that should be included in this framework and addendum, or should it be done through a separate process, maybe through this work group that sounds like is going to be moving forward? And then again, with the ACL, like depending on the specific changes, we might not even need an FMP or regulation change. So it might be worth, maybe considering thinking about it a little bit more through that work group as opposed to through this framework and addendum. So those are the points that we'd like clarification on, and that's all we had. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia and Caitlin. Excellent presentation. I'd like to organize both questions and discussion and even suggested changes around the sort of 4 issues that have been presented. I think that might be the easiest way, and if there's some cross-fertilization, that's fine, but excuse me. Let's start with let's start with clearing my throat. If we could start with conservation equivalency, if you could bring back that slide that was halfway through your, I'm about to turn the mic over to my colleague here because I'm having trouble talking. Okay. I'm sorry. Let's start with conservation equivalency. And if there was a slide about halfway through your, 2/3 way through, I think that had a nice summary of the issues. There we go. I think that might be it. Perfect. So, starting with conservation equivalency, questions for Julia and any suggested changes in terms of the alternatives that are being offered here. Tony DeLernia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think actually the very last item listed there, option to manage the ACL rather than the RHL, I think that should be decided first because there's a significant difference in how each state is affected based on the availability of the fish, the stock, the size of the fish in the waters nearby a particular state, the north-south split. There are a lot of issues that vary, and you get significant differences between ACL and RHL. Between the northern part of the range and the southern part of the range. So I think before you get to conservation equivalency, we should first decide whether or not we're going to manage to the ACL or the RHL.
I'll take you up on that, Tony. So let's begin with that, because it really was an issue that was given quite a bit of thought by staff, by the committee, and by the FMAT, and by the Demersal Committee, and I think there was a sort of inclination to lean toward not having it addressed in this framework action, but perhaps having it folded more into our planning document that we spoke to earlier today. So maybe I'll start with that as the sort of lead question. And I'm sorry, because we now probably have the wrong slide up there, but that's okay. And that is on the issue of the managing to the ACL. You've heard some of the pros and cons, some of the issues associated with that concept. What do the council and board wish to do in terms of addressing or not addressing that issue in this current action that we're considering? Rob O'Reilly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so from what I gathered from the conference calls that I was involved with, there was initial enthusiasm about the ACL process, and as the calls went on, that enthusiasm waned quite a bit because of the differential issues that were expressed a moment ago, depending on where you are in the range. I like the idea that there are recommendations essentially about MRIP on how MRIP can improve. MRIP has been with all the states since 2016, so it may be a little early to know how that will change. I would think it should not be included this time, but I would think we monitor the elements that were recommended to us concerning really it's MRIP in terms of that list of 5 items. So that's my take, sir.
Thank you, Rob. Other thoughts on this issue in particular? John Maniscalco.
So in addition to the issues Tony pointed out, there was also delays with data, increased reliance on estimation of discards, and other things that I think make management by ACLs highly problematic. I'm personally not in favor of it, but if we were to continue to pursue ACLs, I'd rather it be folded into Adam's kind of concept paper rather than pursued under this framework adjustment. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thoughts on that idea in particular of pulling the ACL issue out of this action and folding it or leaving it in where it now lives in this strategy development process to see how it might be applied down the road, but again, not have it be part of this current action. That's so far, those are the 2 comments indicating that preference. Is there concurrence on that as an approach, or does anyone have a different opinion on the issue? Seeing no hands, I'll say, is there any objection to removing the issue from this current action and leaving it just to the 3 issues that we're now going to be discussing? And we can come back to it if we want, but seeing no objection, I'll take that as the will of the board and council that we will defer on this and leave it in the mix, as John indicated, for our broader strategy development, but not ask that it be further developed for this current action. I'll take that as the will of the council and board, unless there's any comments to the contrary. So with that, Tony, now I'd like to go back to conservation equivalency, and I don't know if you had a comment on that one, on that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, regarding conservation equivalency, I see it being compared often to summer flounder. Now, in my experience, while summer flounder are often caught in state waters, I believe the black sea bass fishery is very often prosecuted in federal waters, much more so than in state waters. And so, while I understand the concept of conservation equivalency, if it's going to end up in a state-by-state system, I can't support that. I mean, we just have to look at the behavior of some of the boats. I mean, we have boats from New Jersey going to Block Island on a regular basis to catch black sea bass. It's not uncommon for boats to transverse state lines to prosecute the fishery on a regular basis. And, you know, Block Island last year had, what, a 15-inch minimum size. New Jersey had a 12.5-inch minimum size. And then you end up with the same old story of, you know, boats fishing side by side with differential size limits and possession limits. And so if we're going to use conservation equivalency, it would have to be on a regional approach. I would, again, prefer coastwide measures, but I understand what happens to the southern states, and I don't want to hurt them. So if there is going to be conservation equivalency, it has to be on a regional basis. If we go back to the state-by-state system, it's more of a violation than what we had right now with the summer flounder process. Thank you.
Julia, would you like to speak to that comment?
Yeah, so under the current summer flounder process, there is still the option to do state by state. So the way the alternatives are laid out, that could be something that could be like a decision that's made every year if it's state by state or regional. So we were kind of thinking of it as it doesn't necessarily need to be specified in the alternatives, because the way it's written right now, it could go either way, unless you wanted to say it has to be one way or the other every year. But that's encompassed within the current summer flounder process technically.
So regional approach is going to be part of the range of options that would be considered with regard to conservation equivalency and its potential applicability to the black sea bass fishery, is what I just heard Julia saying. So it doesn't direct that it be that way, but it certainly allows for it to be addressed that way. Additional comments, thoughts on the issue of moving forward with conservation equivalency as an issue in this action? Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking for some clarity from staff about the joint council board allocation decision aspect of it, because the document says that would likely have to happen through a council FMP to put allocations in. So I don't see it as being relevant to this addendum if it's not feasible through a framework.
Julia?
All right. Am I misinterpreting?
It could still be done through this, but it would just mean that instead of this being a framework, it might have to be an amendment. It would just kind of, it could still be the same action. It just might elevate it to an amendment, which we typically talk about them as if amendments take longer to do because we do public hearings for amendments, but not for frameworks. But typically whenever the council revises allocations or implements new allocations through the council process, then that typically we're told that it needs to be an amendment instead of a framework. So it just changed this whole thing to an amendment instead of a framework for us.
Nicola?
I guess it doesn't change my opinion that it is a more complicated option that is not appropriate to this addendum framework, which I'm thinking is meant mainly to put some tools in the toolbox and get some things in place that we can use possibly next year. I think it's a larger lift. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to keep tabs on where we are, we've sort of deleted that third bullet under 1B2, option to manage to the ACL. We now have a suggestion to remove that second bullet, joint council board determination of state regional allocations of RHL. Any further thoughts on what we're now doing, which is winnowing down these potential additional modifications to further development of the conservation equivalency option beyond that which currently exists for summer flounder? Chris Patsevich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding the conservation equivalency rollover, it's mentioned in the brief materials that during the demersal committee call, we talked about the possibility of considering rollover for summer flounder, because right now we don't have conservation equivalency rollover. If that was to be included in this addendum, would that be just a separate option, or now that we're kind of winnowing this down, that summer flounder would be part of this sub-option looking at conservation equivalency rollover?
Good question. Julie, do you have a thought on that?
I think the way that it's framed right now, it would probably have to be a separate alternative, but I don't think it would be all that complicated because it's the same thing that we're considering for black sea bass. And sorry, I forgot to mention that the committee and board subgroup did recommend that.
So just so I understand, and I think I do, that the suggestion now is that that conservation equivalency rollover would stay as applied to black sea bass, but it would also be extended, or there should be an alternative that would allow it to be extended to apply to summer flounder as well. Is that your suggestion, Chris?
Yes.
Thank you. So we have that suggestion on the floor. Further discussion? We've had some, I think, pretty good work done, at least from the comments so far, on sort of winnowing this down to just one bullet, if you will, under 1B2, and we've just actually added a sort of a corollary to that, so it would be both for black sea bass and for summer flounder. Is the board and council comfortable moving forward with this conservation equivalency module in the way that has been discussed and suggested so far? I see pretty much everyone nodding yes, so I'm going to take that as
without objection. We'll move forward. And Julia, are you clear on the guidance on that? Okay, so let's move to the next issue, which is transiting. And to summarize, we have a
sort of a draft proposal right now to address transiting in a somewhat limited way, but it can be, and there's been differences of opinion on whether that can or should be expanded, and if so, to what extent. So I think what we need, and there it is, that's the slide that I was looking for, is board and council discussion on all of the issues that have question marks associated with them. Let's start out with that. I realize there might be some other suggestions as well, so I'll just open the floor to discussion on this issue. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have 3 questions relative to this to help me formulate some discussion. So, in terms of transit, are we talking about transit for the 3 states of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York relative to Block Island? That's part 1.
I'm not sure it's been clarified yet. It's a good question, and I think maybe now's the time to be talking about whether this is intended to apply to any vessel or from any state, or only those vessels from certain states, and you suggested one potential approach. So this is the kind of guidance that we need right now, is how best to frame this issue.
My second question is that I guess the recreational only was the recommendation from the FMAT, and then I have one further question, and then I could offer a comment.
I believe it was the FMAT recommendation. It'd be recreational. Well, let's put it this way. This is a recreational action, recreationally based action, and it was a recommendation. So on that basis, everything was recreational to begin with. And then, as I remember, at the demersal committee, or during the demersal committee discussion, there was a suggestion made by one of the members of the committee to have it applied to commercial as well. That's why we now have, again, as a question mark, commercial as well, and these are the very issues that we need board and council guidance on today. And did you want to follow now, Hasbrook, or Emerson, or did you want to wait?
Yes, I have one final question and then a comment.
Go ahead.
My final question is, did I understand it correctly where it was mentioned that this is a council issue, not a commission issue, and this is just going to be a council decision, not commission? And then I'll offer my comment. Thank you.
I'm going to let Julia, I think you said it well, but I'm going to let you say it again. Go ahead.
So my understanding is that both groups could decide on it, but the regulation changes only need to be made for federal waters. So the actual change to the FMP could be done just through the council's FMP, but both groups could still vote on it together, is how I was thinking about it. I don't know if that's wrong, but that's my understanding.
So that's the proposal, Emerson, is that it doesn't have to involve the board, but there's a suggestion that the board should be part of the joint decision-making process.
Thank you for allowing me to ask those 3 questions. So then my comment is, as this goes forward, I would suggest that we speak about vessels from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York transiting between the state waters of Block Island and Long Island, New York, coastal Connecticut, and coastal Rhode Island.
Thank you. I've taken note of that suggestion and looking for additional board and council comments and feedback on that, and any other thoughts and suggestions. Jim Gilmore?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Julie, if this is going to be based upon the striped bass provisions that are right now, I just wanted to clarify that. So right now, striped bass is, well, since striped bass is closed in the EEZ, it's essentially you can transit the zone, but you can't fish within that area, and there's provisions about how you would store gear and stuff, whatever, or steer, I believe. Secondly, now, if we model this, that you would be allowed to fish for those 3 species if they're open in federal waters in this area, so that would be a difference in striped bass. And lastly, the question is, so for the striped bass, I don't remember, was this recreational and commercial, or was it just recreational?
I think it's just recreational, if I'm not mistaken. Right now, yes. So the answer is yes. It's just recreational transiting allowed in the zone for striped bass. Tony?
And the rationale for that is that federal waters doesn't close for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. And it's the state waters that sometimes can close. And that's why we didn't do it for commercial.
Thank you for that. Helpful. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the council and the commission taking the time on this. I heard Mr. Hasbrook's comments, and I'm fine with that. I'm prepared to offer a motion, and the state of Rhode Island, we have an issue because we have state waters that are inaccessible through federal waters, and that's our problem. It would be my intent to include commercial fishing because we have fishermen who are permitted for state waters only and not federal permits, and they can't access Block Island from the mainland or from the other way around. I have a Rhode Island specific motion. I'm happy to do it. We've already delineated a pretty narrow area that is on chart 13218, and it's actually boundaried by a cable area that's already on that chart, and it can be designated with 4 points. I have no problem if the striped bass zone is open to fluke, sea bass, and scup. That would be fine with me. Right now, fluke, sea bass, and scup are off limits in the transit provision. So, you tell me, Mr. Chairman, what do you want to do? Do you want a specific motion for the state of Rhode Island, or is it sufficient to advise the staff of what our motion is, and perhaps New York can do a similar thing, or is the striped bass zone going to be acceptable for transit with these 3 species?
I think we're here this afternoon to kind of work through these very issues. So I would say, Eric, why don't you go ahead and put your motion up on the board, and we'll see how it flies.
Yeah, Jessica has it. Sorry, Dr. Pierce wrote it for me, but that's another story. Okay. Move to include an additional option that defines a discrete transit zone from Rhode Island state waters around Block Island, Rhode Island, to Rhode Island state waters to the north. Any legally Rhode Island permitted fishing in Rhode Island's waters for summer flounder, black sea bass, and scup will be allowed to transit the EEZ in this zone with legally harvested regulated species as long as gear stowage requirements are met and no fishing occurs in the zone while transiting.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Nicola Meserve. Eric, did you want to speak further to the motion?
Well, I think I spoke to it already. It is a Rhode Island specific area. I think it's about 6 square miles as opposed to what the striped bass area is now. We work with our DEM to develop that narrow area. I apologize for being fairly greedy because I only did it for Rhode Island. I'm happy to do one for New York, but we do have an issue with Block Island being the 51st state, and we'd like to bring them back into the great state of Rhode Island as a whole.
And clearly, just as a reminder, and we will need a council motion, by the way, a like motion from the council in order to move this motion forward. And again, just as a reminder, this is about building out alternatives for further development by staff to be brought back before both bodies in August. So it's not as if this is about choosing which transiting option you feel is better or worse than the other. It's about making sure we've sufficiently framed the issue of transiting within Block Island Sound. So I just feel it's important to note that as a reminder because it almost feels like, we're trying to come to terms with the issue, and that's not where we are yet. We're just trying to ensure that we've got sufficient alternatives that are developed and ultimately if agreed to by the board and council, provided for public comment, offered for public comment. With that, I need I need to see if there is a council, a like motion from the council to move this motion forward. Would anyone from the council like to make this motion? Rob O'Reilly, thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Stu Michaels, I'm sorry. So moved and seconded by both the board and the council. Discussion on the motion. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand what Rhode Island wants to do here, and basically I would not oppose that. I'm just not clear how this might impact transit from Rhode Island waters around Block Island to Long Island, New York, and Connecticut. So I'm not sure what the staff is going to come back with on this, but I don't want this to eliminate transit for vessels from those other states. All right, so the answer to that question will determine whether I support or oppose this motion.
And if I might just offer this thought, and that is, my sense is that this would be in addition to an option that would be either similar to or identical to the one that you had suggested, which is an option involving something very similar to the striped bass zone, perhaps, and perhaps specifically pertaining to vessels from the 3 states, as you had suggested, and that could be further developed via subsequent discussion after this motion is addressed. So it seems to me that would be a nice sort of bookend, if you will, to sort of have one option that addresses Rhode Island, one option like this, and another option that's, say, broader in its applicability, and then look to get some feedback, further development and feedback on it. That's my sense as to where this seems to be heading. Let's see, Mike Bettany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question to try to clarify the intent of the motion, to make sure that the intent is that this would only apply to vessels that only have state permits and not those vessels that are dual permitted in both state and federal waters.
I'm going to look to Eric for a response on that.
Well, the answer is no. If you have a Rhode Island state permit, that doesn't preclude you from having a federal permit. That's not the problem. The problem is state-only permitted vessels. I mean, my intention is if you have a state permit, you're permitted legally in the state of Rhode Island, this would apply to you. Of course, if you have a federal permit, that's an addition, and it really, we don't have to have a big discussion about that. I mean, federal waters is not an issue for these fish. It's when you bring them home.
Mike Bettany.
Okay, so the reason I raised the question is that vessels that hold both state and federal permits are, as a condition of their federal permit, always subject to the more restrictive regulations. So in cases where state waters may be open and federal waters are closed, then those dually permitted vessels are tied to the dock by virtue of their federal permit and the more restrictive measures. It's the state-only permitted vessels where they would be otherwise free to fish in state waters, but then are challenged trying to transit across federal waters where fishing is closed. So that's why I was looking for that clarification.
Point well taken. It looks like we've got some interest on the Rhode Island delegation to offer a response.
Well, I mean, there's no response. Mike's absolutely right. I'm sorry, Mr. Pentney is absolutely right. The most restrictive permit rules, but you know, the reality of it is we have to be able to get from state waters to state waters regardless of what the permit holder has. I mean, if the most restrictive permit doesn't allow them to go fishing, that's one thing, but at this point we're trying to address a problem that we have. But I mean, if you got a federal permit and it's shut down in federal waters, I mean, that's the end of it. But if you have a state permit, you need to be able to get from one side of the state to the other. I guess that's my point.
And Eric, my question would be, how would this apply to recreational fishermen? It looks very commercially oriented to me in the way that it's developed, and I'm thinking that it wasn't intended to preclude transit by rec fishermen, and I'm wondering if you concur, and if so, how we might potentially tweak this. Eric?
Well, basically, Bob, it says Rhode Island permitted fisher. It doesn't say whether it's a commercial or recreational fishing permit. If you've got a recreational saltwater fishing permit, that is a permit. If you don't have a recreational saltwater fishing permit, you're not fishing anyway. So it's not specific to whether it's a federal or state permit. I mean, obviously, you're fishing in state waters, you need a state permit. Whether you're commercial or recreational, you still need a permit. So I did, you know, like I said, you know, we could put another couple of paragraphs on this thing, but I was really trying to make it pretty as simple as possible. Regardless of what the permit is for state waters fishing, you can transit in that zone. I guess that's where I'm coming from, recreational or commercial.
Thank you. Understood. Yeah, Matt Gates.
Yeah, thanks. To that point, is there, you know, the states of Connecticut and Mass and some others have reciprocity recreational fishing. Would that apply to this also, or would it just be if they had the Rhode Island license only?
Eric?
Well, I'm assuming a reciprocity means if you have a license that is legal in one state, it's legal in another, then, I mean, it would be considered a legal permit. I mean, my intent is if you can fish in Rhode Island state waters legally, then have at it. So I'm probably going to need some help on whether or not that's acceptable or not. Of course, you know, once you get back to your own state, you have issues. But I don't want to get too crazy with saying reciprocity, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to, it's my intent to be able to get from one side of the state to the other. That's my intent. And if Connecticut is part of the other side of the state of Rhode Island, that's fine.
But I do take it from that very good exchange that reciprocity would have to be part, or should be part of the development of this option to address how that would apply. I think Matt raises a very good point, and I think that's exactly what we would look to staff to help us do. Tony?
Just for the PDT's clarification, because I'm a little confused based on Mike's question and then your response, are you saying that there should be an exception to the most restrictive rule and people with dual permits should be able to fish, or is it just state water permit holders? Because normally if you have both a federal and a state water permit and you want to fish in state waters, when federal waters is closed, you would drop that federal permit, or that's something that does happen. So I don't know what the PDT would do based on your feedback back to Mike.
I'm not suggesting that anybody drop their permit to subvert the rules by any means. Does that help you?
But are you saying there would be an exception to the most restrictive rule for this one issue to be able to possess?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Not at all.
So then it wouldn't be for dual permit holders, it would be for state permit holders only.
Okay, yes. Did you?
Okay, good clarification there.
Dr. McNamee is, you didn't see my lips move, his lips move at all, but anyway, thanks for that, Doctor.
Okay, so I think that was a very helpful exchange, and it does sound like, based on the input and the questions and the responses, that we're talking state only as worded. In other words, the motion as worded is accurate from the standpoint of what's intended. Further discussion? Bob Beal?
Just a quick point. I think, we're using striped bass as an example, and I think people are using that differently. In other words, I think some folks are saying, implement the exact corridor that exists for striped bass, for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, which is essentially a north-south corridor between Block Island and Point Judith area, and that's it. You can't go east-west. You can't leave Block Island with striped bass on your vessel, head east a little bit south, and end up in Montauk. You'd have to go up and around. You have to do something creative and different. But so, if the intent of the council and the board is to allow folks to leave Block Island and head head west to Montauk, there's going to be additional corridors that need to be established. So, I think that's what has to be defined. Which part of that federal water area between Block Island and mainland, sort of Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, are we seeking to have vessels allowed to possess but not fish for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass when those federal waters are closed?
It's a great question. My sense is that we have two options that are emerging here. One would be an option that would essentially parallel or mirror the current striped bass transiting. And just like that, staff have pulled that up. So that whole shaded area in green is the current federally authorized striped bass transit zone. And that, as I understand it, might be, perhaps should be, option A under transiting for fluke, black sea bass, and scup. That it would be the same area mirroring the striped bass transit zone. A separate suggestion that Eric has offered would be to have a more narrowly defined transit zone just north-south, pretty close to that red line there, probably pretty much hugging that red line between the north end of Block Island and Point Judith. And so it strikes me that where we are in this discussion is considering two options for how to address transiting within Block Island Sound. One being more or less consistent with the way striped bass is currently addressed, the other being an alternative approach that Eric Reed has proposed with his motion. Does that, Bob, does that jibe with your understanding?
Yeah, I think it just has to be defined. What's the expectation on where you're going to be able to, possess striped bass? Summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass during a closed federal water period.
And I think having charts like this would be enormously helpful. Maybe that could be part of the development of these two options. And I think there could be, a chart developed for Eric's motion, if I'm not mistaken. David Borden, and we need to stay focused on the motion right now on the board. This was put up to help answer or address Bob Beal's question. This does not pertain to the current motion before the board and council, but it's offered to help differentiate, if you will. David Borden?
Yeah, just so everyone's clear, when we originally discussed it, the three of us discussed it with our enforcement agency, and we crafted this as a Rhode Island solution, namely because we have a problem of going, it's still part of Rhode Island. You want the boats from Rhode Island to fish in Rhode Island and get back, and they've got to cross that small sliver of green just to the west of the red line there. So we propose this as a solution to the Rhode Island problem. But if the board wants to include a broader application of this to include New York and Connecticut, we would have no objection. Just make it a separate option, that's all. The issue with enforcement is the broader and we have representation here who can probably speak to this better than me, but our enforcement agency basically said, if you're going to have a transit zone, they can't fish. You've got to have all the gear stowed in accordance with the regulations, and you want that transit zone to basically be as narrow as possible. Is that was the advice that we got.
Thank you. So that's if we could. Back up on the board. Let's put back up on the board the motion pending before both bodies. And I'd like to see if there's any further discussion on the motion and then call for a vote on it. We weren't necessarily planning to do a lot of motions here, by the way. A lot of this was intended to be developed via consensus, but in this case, because it's so specific, obviously, I think it does lend itself to a motion. But just know that we don't necessarily have to follow this process for each and every proposed tweak or change. And in fact, I can even ask right now if there's any objection to moving forward with this motion that would add an additional option to the transiting issue. I'll let you think about that. We can put it to a vote, or I can just simply ask if there's any objection, and I'm leaning toward the latter. So let's put it this way. Is there any objection? If there is, we'll caucus and we'll vote. Is there any objection to adding this as an alternative? Steve Hines, go ahead.
Just a question. I'm assuming that this doesn't preclude us adopting the other alternative as well.
We're about to go right back to that and make sure that we've got that ironed out consistent with what I think Emerson has suggested, and perhaps get that subject to any modifications as well. So that's where we're going to go next. But on this issue, I just wanted to see if we could dispense of it. Is there any further discussion? I'm sorry, I'll ask it for the last time. Any objection? Seeing none, we'll consider this adopted by consent, and we'll now go back to maybe the slide that had those other issues in it. And Emerson, I didn't know whether you wanted to, Mike, did you want to make a comment? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to rush through that. I may have sounded like I was, so go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might as well just ask the council, is there any opposition to moving forward? Okay, seeing none, motion carries. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. I realize sometimes forgetting that we have two separate bodies here, and I'm doing my best to facilitate, but thank you, Mike, for clarifying that. So we do have now both board and council, without objection, agreeing to task staff with further development of this option. Now, if we want to sort of take this down or bring back up the the slide that had the other question marks on it with regard to the transiting issue. My sense is, and I'll look to Julia for clarification or confirmation, but my sense is that that sort of option A, if you will, is intended to mirror the striped bass zone, that was going to be the intent. Is that your sense as well, Julia? I'm sorry, 2.B. So there it is. Okay. So there it is. Block Island Sound Transit, well, it actually doesn't say that. So Block Island Sound Transit positions 2B, would it make sense to clarify that this would be one that would be modeled after the striped bass zone to provide a sort of a complement, if you will, to the Rhode Island proposal? Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I would make that suggestion and support that suggestion, as well as to make it specific for the states of New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island as well, depending on the fate of that other option. And I don't know if Massachusetts needs to be included there or not. I'll let them speak for themselves. And I also don't see these as exclusionary, where perhaps both, in the end, perhaps both options get adopted here. So one does not exclude the adoption of the other.
Okay, thank you.
And just to clarify my reasoning, particularly out of Montauk, we have quite a few private anglers as well as charter party boats that fish in that area around Block Island and need to be able to transit from those Rhode Island waters back to Montauk.
Thank you. So on that issue, so now we have per Emerson's suggestion, on the floor is the suggestion that that this 2B, 2.B, only apply to vessels from those three states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. We still need clarification on whether it should be recreational only or commercial and recreational, and then pretty much with regard to both measures. So these can be really, I think, addressed with regard to both the motion that was just passed that Eric Reed offered, as well as this one, whether we're talking just season, as I believe the FMAT had recommended, or bag and size as well. So these are the issues that we need clarification on, and I think they could be addressed for both options. Thoughts on those issues? I don't know whether we could just maybe, I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Just getting back to something Mike Pentney said earlier, as far as commercial goes, if you know, you're bound by the most restrictive rule, then the point's moot. I mean, you shouldn't have the fish. You shouldn't be fishing, state waters included.
Okay. How about season bag size? And again, I guess some of these can be just sort of further developed and offered up as alternatives. I suppose that could be it doesn't have to be decided right now. I guess so they could all be, everything can roll. We don't really need to winnow this down necessarily unless anyone thinks it should. This can all roll forward in the way of alternatives that would be developed for both proposals, rec and commercial, but it sounds like there's some pretty strong reasoning weighing against commercial, and again, that would have to be folded into the development of the alternative, and then again, whether it be just season or bag and size as well. So we don't necessarily need to, address those issues other than to make sure that the board and council are comfortable rolling forward with all of those. David Borden?
I would prefer it if all three of those were included. So it would be both recreational and commercial and all three of those items.
Okay, so the way I'll do it then, because I don't see too many other hands going up, so I get the sense that we're moving through this issue, is there anyone on the board who has any objection to including all of these issues in the development of what I believe are going to be the two sort of alternatives to address transiting in Block Island Sound? Seeing no objection by the board, we'll consider those agreed upon by consent. Mike, do you want to ask the council?
Certainly. Any opposition? Members of the council? Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move forward as suggested.
Thank you. Anything else, Julia, that we need to do on this issue that you can think of? Good. You got the guidance that you were looking for? Perfect. Thank you so much. Last issue, I believe, is slot limits, and I think this was a fairly straightforward issue, but let you all be the judge of that. And I think with slot limits, I'll ask for that slide to be put back up. I'm not sure if there's a sidebar going on over there, but I'll just ask whether anyone has any thoughts on the issue of slot limits. The proposal, as I understand it, is that it would apply to all 3 species. And although, again, questions as to whether or not it may ultimately be applicable, given some of the downsides of adopting some of those provisions, adopting a slot limit approach, but nonetheless having it as a tool in the toolbox. Is there any thoughts on this? Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And although since 2009 we've heard the impractical part of slot limits, and at that time the monitoring committee had said if there was a restored or a fishery that had achieved its target SSB, that'd be a great time to have an experiment with slot limits. I'm not sure that's completely true, but I do know there's been a lot of interest over the years from the public, many different times expressed in many different states, and I think at least until we know for certain that they are impractical, we should at least follow through here.
Thank you. Tony DeLernia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the committee call, I spoke against the use of slot limits in the black sea bass fishery. And the reason I do so is because I had mentioned earlier that I believe that the black sea bass fishery, much of it occurred in federal waters, which means deeper waters. And barotrauma becomes a significant issue when you're dealing with the maximum size for a black sea bass. I don't believe the sending devices that have been advocated for by the agency would be effective. If you try to descend a large black sea bass on a descending device in November, what you do is you hold it captive for while a spiny dogfish comes along to eat it on the way down. So I don't think the slot limit would be an effective way of managing the fishery if we're going to have a maximum size limit. Also, I've spoken again and again and again. You've heard me ad nauseum on the letter of authorization, and that letter of authorization program is designed really to target the larger fish from deep water. And the slot limit would actually speak against that fishery completely. So I don't believe a slot limit for black sea bass would be appropriate. Summer flounder is a different story. Shallow water, a little bit different, but not for black sea bass. Thank you.
Thank you. And during the staff presentation, it was also noted that Scup seems to have very little relevance as well. So I think the real question to both the council and board is whether this should be limited to just summer flounder, or whether it should include and be applicable to black sea bass and Scup as well, recognizing that there may well be very strong reasons not to consider ever imposing or enacting a slot limit, but rather is it a tool that should be in the toolbox for potential use, or not even in the toolbox at all, not available for any fishery other than summer flounder? That's the sense I get in terms of the discussion so far. Rob O'Reilly?
Yes, so I agree on the summer flounder end of it, which states can do now under conservation equivalency. If there's some changes and it ends up that there's not conservation equivalency, then that's my only take on this, that we want to make sure that we still follow through here. But the way things stand now, the way I understand it, the states and the regions could go ahead and have slot limits for summer flounder. The black sea bass issue I understand perfectly well, but I just wondered if this would give any more emphasis to what a lot of the public has wanted for a number of years for summer flounder. Thank you.
Thank you. John Maniscalco.
I'm in favor of having maximum size as a potential tool, but I would just remind everyone that if your minimum size is much larger than minimum size is found elsewhere, then a maximum size has a very different impact on the access your fisheries have. So it should be used judiciously. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess the way I look at it is, if it's offered up as an option to have slot limits be applicable to all 3 species during the board's final consideration, in August. There could be a final decision as to whether or not to include it. And of course, based on public comment and the final board decision in December, it could stay or go, depending on, but at this point, typically, I know what happens is we try to be as inclusive as possible with regard to options, and the document, and I'm sure staff are aware of this, should speak to the pros and cons of the issue. So, I mean, I'm sensing, I'm hearing two different perspectives, and I'm trying to find a comfortable middle ground here in terms of whether we include all three species or just limit it to one or two. Adam Nowalski?
I'll offer a voice of concurrence for what you just stated, that there's no harm in leaving them in. I'm not aware that staff has indicated this increases the workload in any way that I've been aware, and leave it in here for right now, and if we ultimately decide later to take it out, fine. If we don't, but we have the tool, but never use it in the next 10 years, we didn't do any additional work. So I concur with your latest comments.
David Borden.
Yeah, I would agree with that basically, and encourage us to standardize the rules. In this particular plan, try to standardize the rules across the recreational fishery, in other words, the management options, so that it gets too confusing otherwise. You don't, and when somebody brings up a point like Tony's, and there's a good logic for not doing something, then you don't use a technique, but at least you don't have three sets of rules for three different species.
Thanks. Additional comments? I'm getting a sense that the board is starting to come around in support of keeping it applicable to all three, but I'll ask for any final comments. Tom Foti?
I kind of agree with Tony. I mean, it's a different species. It's not like summer flounder. It changes from female to male. And usually we're protecting the females because we figure they're laying more eggs. And this is just the opposite. So I really don't get the point here of why we need to put black sea bass in it.
Okay, here's where it gets fun. So because there's a difference of opinion, we're going to have to do a motion, I think. And so for right now, the proposal is to have it applied to all three. If anyone would like to make a motion to have it be limited to one or two of the three species, now would be the time to make that motion. Tony?
You're saying by including it, we're not including increasing staff time, we're not delaying anything, everything's going to be just fine. Okay, so you want to do it and go ahead, take it out to public hearing and go right ahead. I mean, I think it's a dumb idea, really. But so long as it's not going to increase workload and it's going to make everybody feel happy, leave it there.
This is not what I want to do. This is what you all want to do. But thank you for essentially backing off. With that, is there any objection to moving forward with this issue in the way it's been presented by staff? And I'm asking the board. Seeing no objection, Mike, do you want to query the council?
Move forward as proposed for all three. Anyone have any opposition? Okay, seeing none. Back to you, Bob.
Okay. Julia, we've pretty much dispensed, I think, with all of the issues. If I'm not mistaken, but I'll look to you all, to you and Caitlin, to see if there's anything left to address and whether you have enough guidance to go on for further development of this document.
As long as there are no additional alternatives that anyone wants to add, then I think we're good.
Thank you for that prompt. Are there any additional alternatives that anyone would like to add other than those that have been presented? Seeing none, is there anyone from the public that would like to comment? I think we've had a pretty healthy discussion, and of course the public's going to have full opportunity to weigh in once this goes out to the public. So having reached consensus on a way forward on all three issues, we do need a final motion from both the council and the board, and that would be to move to approve the draft alternatives as presented by staff and as modified today by the actions of the board and council for the recreational framework and addendum. I'd like to see if there's a motion by the board to approve, and I see Emerson on behalf of the board, and a second by Rep. Peak. So moved and seconded by the board. The council, anyone, motion from the council to move forward with this as proposed and as modified today? Steve Hines, is there a second? Seconded by Peter Defer. We have council and board motions that have been made and seconded. Any further discussion? Any need to caucus? Make sure the motion is up on the board. I'll read it again into the record. Move to approve the draft alternatives as presented by staff and as modified today for the recreational framework and addendum. Any need to caucus? Is there any objection on the part of the board? Seeing none, Mike, would you like to call the question for the council?
Same question for the council. Any objection? Okay, seeing no objection, the motion carries.
Thank you, and that completes this agenda item, and we're on to our last item of the day, I believe, and that's a presentation of preliminary February harvest estimates for recreational black sea bass, and I believe Caitlin Starks is planning to offer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll go through this very briefly. Just give you a quick overview of the 2018 February black sea bass recreational harvest estimates. So as you recall, the board and council approved like motions to open a black sea bass recreational fishery for February 2018 with a 15 fish possession limit and 12.5 inch minimum size limit. And 100,000 pounds were set aside for this fishery, and the board and council agreed to allocate this amount among the states based on their average wave 1 black sea bass catch, which was estimated by using federal for higher VTR data from 1996 to 2009 and of 2013 as well. Only Virginia and North Carolina ended up opting into the February fishery. So in this table, you can see each state's proportion of wave 1 harvest that was allocated to them based on historical data and the resulting allocation in pounds for each of these states when that percentage was applied to the 100,000 pounds for the February fishery. And Virginia and North Carolina's allocations highlighted in blue were 5,496 pounds for Virginia and 62 pounds for North Carolina. So the total anticipated harvest for this February was 5,558 pounds. And we now have preliminary harvest estimates for each state, which are shown up here. So Virginia's preliminary estimate is between 4,826 pounds and 5,206 pounds, which I'll explain in a moment. And North Carolina's estimate is 0 pounds. So the Virginia Marine Resources Commission required mandatory reporting for all black sea bass harvested during 2018 February season and estimated that there were about 550 hours of law enforcement that went in during February. A total of 2,540 black sea bass were reported as kept, and this was between private anglers and the for-hire fleet. And of these trips, the VMRC staff sampled 75 fish from 4 private recreational trips and rode on 4 of 5 party boat trips that occurred in February. And as you saw on the last slide, their estimate for harvest is a range, which has to do with the average weight that was used to convert this number of fish to pounds. So the average weight from private vessels was 1.7 pounds per fish, and the staff also reviewed MRIP average weights across all modes for waves 5 and 6 in 2017 and found that the averages were 1.7 pounds for wave 5 and 1.9 pounds for wave 6. So when this 1.9 pound average is applied to all modes for February, Virginia's harvest estimate is 4,826 pounds. And because sampling on party boats only included lengths and not weights, the VMRC staff used the 2015 to 2017 length weight regression from data collected by the Northeast Fisheries Science Center for the southern region and calculated an average weight of 2.18 pounds for the party boat samples. So applying that weight to the fish harvested by the party boats and still using the 1.9 pounds for the private mode, the total estimate for Virginia's February harvest goes up to 5,206 pounds. And for North Carolina, things were a little easier. Division of Marine Fisheries staff intended to collect black sea bass carcasses for age and growth samples from charter boat captains that were targeting black sea bass north of Cape Hatteras. But there was very low fishing effort during the season. There were only 2 known trips, and no carcasses were able to be collected. So MRIP staff also reported 0 intercepts with black sea bass north of Cape Hatteras in February. Weather conditions prevented a lot of boats from going out through Oregon Inlet, and that played a role in the minimal fishing effort. So again, their estimate is 0. And as a reminder, the board and council will consider a 2019 Wave 1 fishery at the next joint meeting in August. So it may be worth thinking about any desired changes to this process or the requirements that were implemented this year for the February fishery for next year's fishery. And additionally, if desired, the board and council can task the technical and monitoring committees to evaluate these harvest estimates from Virginia and North Carolina when they meet in their July meeting. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Caitlin. I know Roger Mann has left the room, but I just couldn't help but note that North Carolina's 62 pounds comes out to 992 ounces. I just thought that was important to note. Are there any questions for Caitlin? Jim Gilmore.
I just have to say this, so if, the MRIP guys had hit one of those 2 trips, I'd like to see what the landings would have come out to be. It probably would have been 200,000 pounds of black sea bass, but just that as.
Any further comments? Is there any desire to have the board and council task the TC and monitoring committee to evaluate harvest estimates as part of their July meeting? I don't see any indications, so I guess there's not a desire to do so, unless anyone wishes to offer that. With that, are there any further questions or comments on this agenda item? Yes, Tony DeLernia.
Mr. Chairman, I find it 550 law enforcement hours for 5,000 pounds worth of fish. There's something wrong there. We're doing something wrong. If that's, the cost of enforcing a 5,000 pound limit there has to be a better way. I think it's called the yellow way. Thanks.
Thank you. Any further comments? Seeing none, is there any other business to come before the board? Seeing none, is there any objection to adjourning? Seeing none, we are adjourned, and the Bluefish Board will be meeting jointly, I guess, with the MID in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That would be 3:32. 3:32, we'll reconvene Bluefish Board and with the MID. Thank you.